Spring 1943, a dim hangar outside Hamburg. German engineers gather around the wreckage of a downed British bomber. Their white coats are already stained with oil and graphite. The aircraft was captured almost intact. It lay disassembled under harsh floodlights. Its paled panels looked absurdly domestic. It looked like something stolen from a carpentry shop rather than the sky. They had been told this was the fastest bomber in the British arsenal. They were told it could outrun their best Messerschmitts at full throttle. To the Luftwaffe's elite engineers, that claim was a tactical insult. Dr. Karl-Heinz Ankel, a senior materials analyst, adjusted his spectacles. He tapped one of the panels with a knuckle. The sound was not metallic. It was dull and resonant. It was like knocking on a coffin. "It's plywood," he muttered. Around him, the technicians laughed. They expected to find shortcuts and desperation. They expected to see a nation that had run out of aluminum. They did not expect to find a masterpiece. Outside, the rain hissed against the hangar roof. Inside, the smell of phenolic resin filled the air. It was sharp and chemical. It was the smell of the secret that would humiliate the Reich for the next 2 years. The technical reality of 1940s aviation was defined by rivets. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a study in metal. It was held together by thousands of tiny, drag-inducing fasteners. But as the Germans ran their hands over the Mosquito, they found nothing. No jagged edges, no overlapping plates. The fuselage was a single, seamless monocoque. It was as smooth as a grand piano. The British had bypassed the traditional assembly line. They weren't using riveters. They were using cabinet makers. They weren't using heavy machinery. They were using clamps and glue. This was the wooden wonder. It was performing an arithmetic of speed that the Germans couldn't calculate. Ankel ordered a cross-section cut of the fuselage. The blade passed through the material with an eerie, soft resistance. When the slice was revealed, the engineers went silent. The fuselage was a sandwich. It consisted of 2 thin skins of premium birch plywood. Between them lay a core of balsa wood. Balsa is the lightest wood in the world. It is usually reserved for toys and model gliders. But the British had weaponized it. They had used it as a structural stabilizer. It provided incredible thickness and strength without the weight of a metal frame. The Mosquito didn't need a heavy internal skeleton of ribs and spars. The skin itself was the structure. This wasn't a desperate substitute for aluminum. This was a pure mathematics. The Germans checked the captured performance logs. The Mosquito had no defensive guns. It had no heavy turrets. In traditional warfare, defensive armament is a security blanket, but it comes with a cost. Guns add weight. Turrets create drag. Geoffrey de Havilland, the architect of this machine, had discarded the blanket. He believed that speed was the only armor that mattered. If a plane flew at 400 miles per hour, an interceptor had less than 10 seconds to track it. Most of the time, the Luftwaffe found only empty air. Hermann Göring was the most furious man in the Reich. He looked at the reports from Reichland and felt a rhythmic rage. "I am furious when I see the Mosquito," he famously admitted. He realized the British were geniuses who could innovate in a shed. He accused his own staff of being wooden-headed bureaucrats. It wasn't just a defeat of the German Air Force. It was a defeat of the German imagination. The Mosquito almost died in a filing cabinet. In 1938, the British Air Ministry was obsessed with metal. They wanted heavy bombers. They wanted armored turrets. They wanted the security of steel. The prevailing military theory was that a bomber needed to be a flying fortress. It needed to be bristling with machine guns. It needed to be able to fight its way to the target and back. Geoffrey de Havilland walked into their offices with a different philosophy. He proposed an unarmed bomber made of wood. The officials were unimpressed. They viewed wood as a primitive material. They saw a lack of guns as a suicide mission. They called it Freeman's Folly, after Sir Wilfrid Freeman. He was the Air Member for Development and Production. He was the only man in the Air Ministry who saw the genius in de Havilland's arithmetic. The establishment believed a wooden plane belonged in 1914, not 1940. They thought wood was for gliders and toys. They feared that a single incendiary bullet would turn the plane into a torch. De Havilland ignored this skepticism. He understood a clinical reality they couldn't see. Speed is a form of armor. He realized that the weight of turrets, gunners, and ammunition was a parasitic load. It slowed the aircraft down. It made the bomber a sitting duck for faster interceptors. If a plane is fast enough, it doesn't need guns. If it can outfly the interceptors, it doesn't need heavy defense. He designed a machine with two massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. These were the same engines powering the Spitfire. But while the Spitfire had to drag a metal airframe, de Havilland's plane would be light. It would be aerodynamic. He stripped away the heavy turrets. He eliminated the extra crew members. He reduced the crew to just two men, a pilot and a navigator. By removing the weight of the metal armor and the drag of the gun positions, he unlocked a new arithmetic of velocity. The Air Ministry eventually gave him a small contract for a single prototype. It was a low-priority project. It was buried at the bottom of the production schedule. They essentially told him to play with his wooden toy while they focused on real metal bombers. But as the war began, the clinical reality of resource management shifted. The persistence of a single designer had saved the project. The wooden wonder was ready to prove that the establishment's folly was actually a masterstroke. By 1940, Britain was an island under siege. The supply of aluminum was a disaster. The U-boat blockade in the Atlantic was tightening. Ships carrying bauxite were being sent to the bottom of the ocean. Every scrap of metal was destined for the fighter groups. The bomber command was starving for resources. This was where de Havilland's logic became a masterpiece of logistics. He didn't need the metal industry. He didn't need specialized shipyards or massive aluminum foundries. He needed the furniture industry. Across England, cabinet makers and piano builders were sitting idle. The demand for luxury furniture had vanished overnight. These men were not traditional aviation workers, but their skills were precision-based. They were masters of tolerances. They understood the vernacular of wood. The Mosquito was designed to be built in pieces. It was a modular masterpiece. Wing sections and fuselages were constructed in small workshops and furniture factories scattered across the countryside. High-end piano companies like Challen Pianos stopped making grand pianos. They started making wing spars. Cabinet makers like Libus started producing fuselage halves. These parts were then trucked to a central hangar at Hatfield for final assembly. The distributed manufacturing was a clinical advantage. It was a decentralized production line. You couldn't bomb the Mosquito factory because the factory was the entire country. While the Luftwaffe targeted massive industrial hubs, the Mosquito parts were being shaped in small towns and villages. The aircraft used Ecuadorian balsa wood and Canadian birch. It used spruce from the Pacific Northwest. These were materials that could be sourced and transported in ways that bypassed the aluminum bottlenecks. Britain had weaponized its shortages. They had turned a lack of metal into a surplus of speed. The piano makers were no longer building instruments for music. They were building instruments for war. They were applying the same care they used for a concert hall to a machine that would fly at 400 miles per hour. This used a workforce that the metal industry hadn't even considered. It brought thousands of skilled craftsmen into the war effort without taking them away from other vital tasks. Every Mosquito was a testament to the arithmetic of survival. It was a machine born of necessity, but executed with the grace of high art. The Reich was looking for factories. They should have been looking for wood shops. By the time they realized the scale of the production, the sky was already full of the wooden wonder. The fuselage of the Mosquito was a clinical masterpiece of structural architecture. It was not a frame covered in skin. The skin was the frame. This is the monocoque philosophy, a single shell designed to carry every aerodynamic load. The geometry was incredibly precise. The shell consisted of 2 layers of birch plywood. Each layer was only 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters thick. Between these layers lay a 10-millimeter core of Ecuadorian balsa wood. Balsa is mostly air and fiber. It is a natural honeycomb. It provided the fuselage with immense thickness. This thickness prevented the thin birch skins from buckling under high-G maneuvers, but it did so without a weight penalty. The entire fuselage was a lightweight, rigid sandwich. It was an engineering ghost. Radar waves often passed right through the wood. They found nothing to bounce off of. The wood was only half the secret. The real weapon was the chemistry of the bond. Early wooden aircraft relied on casein glue. This was a protein-based adhesive made from milk. It had a fatal weakness. It was organic. In the heat and humidity of the tropics, casein rotted. The aircraft literally fell apart in the air. De Havilland solved this with a shift to synthetic resins. They utilized aerolite. This was a urea formaldehyde adhesive. It was a clinical breakthrough in materials science. It was waterproof. It was fungus-proof. It was heat-resistant. Once the resin cured, the bond was stronger than the wood fibers themselves. The structural integrity was tested to the extreme. The fuselage had to withstand a pressure of over 20 pounds per square inch. It had to maintain its shape while diving at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour. The birch skins were applied in long, diagonal strips. This orientation maximized the torsional rigidity of the tube. It prevented the aircraft from twisting under the massive torque of the twin engines. German labs at Reichland performed a strategic audit of the captured fragments. They tried to dissolve the glue. They failed. They found that the birch would shatter before the aerolite bond would give way. This chemistry allowed the Mosquito to operate in the sub-zero temperatures of high-altitude bombing. It survived the sweltering humidity of the Pacific. The production process was equally brilliant. The fuselage was built in 2 vertical halves. These halves were shaped over massive concrete or mahogany molds. This allowed technicians to install the wiring and the oxygen lines with total access. They installed the control cables and the hydraulic systems. They didn't have to crawl into a cramped tube. Once the internals were set, the 2 halves were joined. They used a scarf joint along the top and bottom center lines. They applied the resin. They clamped the halves together until the bond turned the wood into a rock. The Germans looked at these seamless joints. They saw a future they weren't prepared for. They were still thinking in terms of rivets and aluminum. The British were thinking in terms of molecular bonds. The Balsa equation had calculated a path to victory without a single ounce of strategic metal. The wooden wonder was ready to move from the workshop to the clouds. The birth of the Mosquito did not happen in a massive industrial complex. It happened in a 17th-century manor house called Salisbury Hall. This was a moated estate near Hatfield. It was the ultimate camouflage. German reconnaissance pilots looked for sprawling factories. They did not look for an ancient house surrounded by a quiet forest. Inside the manor, the rooms were filled with drafting tables. The stables were converted into workshops. The first prototype was designated W-4050. It was built in total secrecy by a hand-picked team. They worked through the Blitz. They worked while the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on London just 20 miles away. By October 1940, the aircraft was ready. It was disassembled. It was moved by truck to the Hatfield airfield. The engineers painted it bright yellow. This was the standard color for British prototypes. It was a signal to anti-aircraft crews. It told them not to fire on the mysterious new shape. On November 25, 1940, the machine was fueled. The pilot was Geoffrey de Havilland, Jr. He was the son of the designer. The aircraft was powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 engines. These liquid-cooled V-12s produced 1,460 horsepower each. The engines were mounted in sleek nacelles. These nacelles were designed to minimize drag. They housed the radiators and the oil coolers in a unique leading-edge intake. Geoffrey Jr. climbed into the cockpit. He taxied to the grass runway. He pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration was violent. The lightweight wooden airframe surged. It lifted off in less than 600 feet. In the air, the Mosquito was a revelation. It was agile. It was stable. It was impossibly fast. During the initial flight tests, the aircraft reached a top speed of 392 miles per hour. At that time, the frontline Spitfire Mark II had a top speed of roughly 370 miles per hour. The Air Ministry officials were stunned. They were looking at a bomber that could outrun the world's most famous fighter. The Wooden Wonder had performed a miracle of physics. It carried a payload capacity similar to a heavy bomber, but it moved with the grace of an interceptor. The test logs confirmed a clinical victory. The Mosquito was the fastest aircraft in the world. It could climb to 20,000 feet in under 9 minutes. It had a service ceiling of 37,000 feet. The skeptics who had mocked Freeman's folly went silent. The Air Ministry immediately increased the order. They realized they hadn't just bought a plane. They had bought a technological advantage. The wooden airframe allowed for a degree of smoothness that metal couldn't match. There were no rivet heads to disrupt the airflow. The laminar flow over the wings was near perfect. The prototype's wing loading was high, but the handling remained predictable. It could pull 6G turns without structural failure. It could dive at 450 miles per hour without a hint of wing flutter. The project was no longer an experiment. It was the spearhead of the British air offensive. The miracle at Hatfield was complete. The machine was ready for the front lines. It was time to introduce the German leadership to the new language of the sky. The raids on Berlin were about to begin. January 30th, 1943. Berlin is dressed in banners. It is the 10th anniversary of the Nazi Party's rise to power. The capital is a fortress. Every anti-aircraft battery is manned. The world is watching. Hermann Göring is the head of the Luftwaffe. He has made a public promise. He told the German people that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb Berlin in daylight. He is scheduled to speak at 11 a.m. The event is being broadcast live across the nation. At that exact moment, 3 Mosquitoes from the number 105 Squadron are crossing the German border. They are led by Squadron Leader Reynolds. They are flying at extreme low altitude. They are skimming the treetops at 50 feet. They are moving at over 300 miles per hour. The German radar operators are confused. The Freya and the Würzburg systems are designed to track large metal formations. The wooden airframes return a faint, ghost-like signal. By the time the batteries are alerted, the aircraft are already past. In Berlin, Göring approaches the microphones at the Haus des Rundfunks. He is prepared to celebrate a decade of air superiority. Suddenly, the air raid sirens begin to wail. The sound of explosions rattles the windows of the broadcasting hall. The British bombs hit the main power station. They hit the radio transmission lines. The live broadcast goes silent. For the first time in the war, the German public hears the static of failure. The leader of the Luftwaffe has been silenced by a handful of wooden aircraft. The aircraft used for this mission were Mosquito B Mark IVs. Each carried 4 500-pound bombs. They had traveled 600 miles to reach the target at exactly 11:30. The timing was a clinical precision strike, but the humiliation is not finished. At 4 p.m., a second flight of Mosquitoes arrives. These are from the number 139 Squadron. They arrive just as Joseph Goebbels is beginning his speech. They drop their payloads with identical accuracy. Once again, the broadcast is interrupted. Once again, the German people are forced to acknowledge the vulnerability of their capital. The Luftwaffe is ordered to intercept. Every available fighter is scrambled. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climb into the sky with a desperate urgency. They look for the heavy bombers they are trained to kill. They find nothing. The Mosquitoes are already at 25,000 feet. They are heading west at full throttle. Their Merlin 21 engines are running at plus 12 pounds of boost. The German pilots push their BMW 801 and DB 605 engines to the limit. They cannot close the gap. The British planes are simply too fast. The interceptors return to base with empty guns and overheated engines. Göring is beyond rage. He holds an emergency meeting with the Luftwaffe High Command. He looks at the technical reports. He looks at the wooden fragments recovered from previous crashes. "I am furious when I see the Mosquito," he screams at his generals. "It makes me green and yellow with envy." He realizes the British have achieved a total tactical leverage. They have produced a machine that ignores the traditional laws of aerial combat. They are using a material that Germany considered obsolete. They are using labor that Germany considered unskilled. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft, Göring lamented. He realized that every piano maker in England was now a threat to his reputation. The daylight raids on Berlin changed the arithmetic of the war. They proved that no target was safe. They proved that speed was a more effective defense than any armor plate. The myth of the invincible Luftwaffe had been shattered by a machine built of balsa and glue. The secret was out. But for the Germans, the real nightmare was just beginning. They were about to realize that they couldn't shoot the Mosquito down. They had to try and copy it. Dr. Karl-Heinz Enkel was a man of cold logic. He worked in the materials laboratory at Reichland. His task was to find the technical weaknesses in the Mosquito skin. He analyzed the captured fragments under high-powered lenses. He was looking for the point where the structure would fail. He used a universal testing machine to measure tensile strength. He tried to break the bond between the birch and the balsa. He used hydraulic presses to apply thousands of pounds of force. In every metal aircraft, the failure point is the rivet. The metal tears at the holes. The rivets shear under the stress of high-speed vibration. But the Mosquito was different. When Enkel applied the pressure, the wood fibers tore apart. The glue did not. The bond was stronger than the natural grain of the wood. The resin didn't just hold the layers together. It fused them at a molecular level. Enkel's team discovered the British secret, aerolite. This was a urea formaldehyde resin. It was a synthetic breakthrough. It relied on a specific hardener that allowed it to cure at room temperature. Germany had its own version. It was called Tegofilm. It was a dry adhesive sheet produced by the Goldman factory in Wuppertal. But Tegofilm was brittle. It required a temperature of 150 degrees Celsius to set. It required a pressure of 300 pounds per square inch. It was difficult to use for complex, curved shapes like a Mosquito fuselage. The British aerolite was a liquid. It seeped into the pores of the wood before it cured. It created a mechanical lock that was nearly impossible to break. It turned the entire aircraft into a single, synthetic crystal of organic fiber. Enkel's report to the High Command was a clinical admission of defeat. He stated that the British had achieved a level of material science that Germany had ignored. While the Reich perfected the metallurgy of steel and aluminum, the British perfected the chemistry of polymers. Erwin Göring read the report. He was confronted with a reality he couldn't ignore. The Mosquito was not a toy made of wood. It was a high-technology composite. It was the ancestor of modern carbon fiber. The British glue survived the vibration of the Merlin engines at 3,000 RPM. It survived the sub-zero temperatures of 30,000 feet. It was immune to the rot and fungus of the Pacific jungle. German science had no immediate answer. Their chemists were years behind de Havilland's team. The laboratory audit proved that the Mosquito's speed was not just about the engines. It was about the surface. The glue allowed for a perfectly smooth finish. The drag coefficient was significantly lower than the BF-109. There were no rivet heads to create parasitic drag. The aircraft was aerodynamically cleaner than any metal plane in the Luftwaffe. Göring realized that he couldn't wait for his chemists to catch up. He needed a wooden fighter immediately. He ordered the development of the TA-154. It was nicknamed the Mücke, or Mosquito. It was a direct attempt to copy the British Miracle. But the British had one more move to play in this technical game of chess. On the night of September 1943, the RAF launched a targeted raid on Wuppertal. They used Mosquitoes. They targeted the Goldman factory. This was the only plant in Germany capable of producing the Tego film adhesive. The factory was leveled. The specialized vats were destroyed. The irony was absolute. The Mosquito had destroyed the only factory that could help Germany build its own Mosquito. The Mücke was now a plane without a bond. German engineers were forced to use inferior, acidic glues. These substitutes were a disaster. The laboratory defeat had moved from the microscope to the front lines. The tragedy of the German Mosquito was about to begin. Kurt Tank was the lead designer for the Focke-Wulf. He was a man of cold, technical precision. He saw the Mosquito as a direct challenge to his reputation. Göring demanded an answer. Tank provided the TA-154. He nicknamed it the Mücke, or Mosquito. It was a twin-engine, high-wing monoplane. It was built almost entirely of wood. It was designed to be a night fighter. Its primary mission was to hunt the British Mosquito. The first prototype flew in July 1943. The performance was impressive. It reached speeds of 404 miles per hour. Tank believed he had matched the British arithmetic. He had the engines, he had the wood, he had the speed. But the machine was held together by a fragile thread. It relied on Tego film. This was the specialized adhesive from the Goldman factory in Wuppertal. It was the only glue German engineers trusted for high-stress airframes. Then the RAF arrived. In a targeted strike, British bombers leveled the Goldman factory. They wiped out the entire stockpile of Tego film. They destroyed the chemical vats. The German aviation industry was suddenly paralyzed. They had the planes, but they had no way to bond them. Kurt Tank was forced to find a substitute. He turned to a cold-setting urea glue called Koret. The chemists at Ig Farben warned him. Koret was acidic. It was unstable. But Tank had no choice. The production lines were already moving. The Reich was desperate for interceptors. The first production models of the TA-154 were assembled using the new glue. The technical failure was absolute. The Koret adhesive contained a high percentage of hardener. This hardener acted as a catalyst, but in the presence of moisture, it produced formic acid. During a critical test flight in 1944, the structural mat collapsed. The pilot was performing high-speed maneuvers. Suddenly, the aircraft began to vibrate. Without warning, the wing spar disintegrated. The wings folded back like paper. The aircraft broke apart in midair. The investigation revealed a horrifying chemical reality. The acidic Koret glue hadn't just failed to bond. It had actively eaten into the wood fibers. It had digested the structural integrity of the wing from the inside out. The wood was charred and brittle. It had the strength of a dry cardboard. Tank was forced to ground the entire fleet. The program was canceled. Only about 50 aircraft were ever built. It was a total technical humiliation. Germany had the wood, they had the engines, they had the aerodynamic knowledge. but they lacked the chemical bond. The British had won the war of materials. They had protected their own secret while destroying the only factory that could replicate it. The Mücke was dead. The British Mosquito remained the undisputed master of the high-altitude skies. The tragedy of the German copy was a clinical lesson in the importance of details. In the sky, a single chemical mistake is as fatal as a bullet. The Reichsdream of Wooden Wonder had literally dissolved in a vat of acid. The war ended in 1945, but the logic of the Mosquito did not die with the conflict. It evolved. The aircraft had performed a clinical disruption of aviation history. It proved that metal was not the only language of power. The wooden monocoque fuselage was the direct ancestor of modern composite flight. Today, we build the world's most advanced jets from carbon fiber and Kevlar. We use synthetic resins and heat-cured bonds. This is the exact methodology Geoffrey de Havilland pioneered in a drafty manor house in 1945. The Mosquito was also the world's first unintentional stealth aircraft. Its wooden structure lacked the sharp radar return of a metal frame. It was nearly invisible to early German radar systems. This was an accidental masterpiece of electronic warfare. Geoffrey de Havilland moved from the wooden wonder to the jet age. He developed the DH-106 Comet. This was the world's first commercial jetliner. The engineering lessons of the Mosquito shaped its birth. They learned how to manage high-speed airflow. They learned how to bond materials to withstand immense pressure. By the end of its service, the Mosquito had flown over 50 different types of missions. It was a fighter. It was a bomber. It was a reconnaissance platform. It was a pathfinder. It could carry a 4,000-pound cookie bomb. This was a payload usually reserved for massive, 4-engine heavy bombers like the Lancaster. The Mosquito achieved the lowest loss rate of any aircraft in RAF Bomber Command. It was only 0.63%. For comparison, the heavy bomber loss rate often exceeded 3%. The Mosquito was the most efficient weapon in the British arsenal. It delivered a greater bomb load per gallon of fuel than any other platform. The German engineers at Reichland were right to be afraid. They weren't just looking at a captured bomber. They were looking at the future of flight. They were looking at a machine that didn't just win battles. It changed the architecture of the sky. The legacy of the Mosquito is visible in the Eurofighter Typhoon. It is visible in the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Both rely on the monocoque, composite skin philosophy. The British had bypassed the age of aluminum and jumped straight into the age of polymers. The Mosquito was a machine built from the trees and the chemistry of the earth. It was a triumph of intelligence over industrial scarcity. It proved that the most advanced technology doesn't always come from a massive factory. Sometimes it comes from a furniture shop. It comes from a designer who refuses to follow a flawed manual. Geoffrey de Havilland saw a path that the experts ignored. He understood that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. The wooden wonder remains a clinical example of strategic innovation. It was the right machine at the right time. It was the perfect bond of wood and will. It was a weapon that forced an empire to rewrite its physics and its future. The arithmetic of the Mosquito remains undefeated. It is a story of precision. It is a story of chemistry. It is the story of how a violin of the skies outpaced the machines of war. If this deep dive into the engineering of the Mosquito was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Subscribe for more strategic autopsies of the machines that defined history. Leave a comment below. If you were in charge in 1940, would you have bet the war on a wooden airplane? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.